If you live outside of Japan, Dragon Quest Monsters kind of went dark after Joker 2. Unless you were importing Japanese copies of the rest of the series that followed, you were out of luck. No remakes, no Joker 3, nothing. I suppose that's why our excitement was tempered when Dragon Quest Monsters' 20th anniversary was coming up in 2018. Sure, they announced a brand new Monsters title featuring Erik and Mia from Dragon Quest XI, and it would be an original entry, not a sequel to Joker 3 or another remake, but it was a Japanese-only broadcast, and it had been 8 years since anything Monsters related made its way into our hands. Things were looking pretty bleak. And then Dragon Quest proper had its 35th anniversary just 3 years later, with a new broadcast, this time translated into English, and then things got confusing. It was revealed there that the Dragon Quest Monsters they had previously announced was now going to be something completely different. How different? Well, that would be explained at a later time. Over a year later, we were given a gameplay trailer, and it was immediately clear that this was not going to fill the void Dragon Quest Monsters left behind. And that was the preamble to the release of Dragon Quest Treasures, an action RPG that was announced as a Dragon Quest Monsters game, and then at some point in development retooled into what it ended up becoming. A lot of fans were understandably disappointed. Imagine the excitement we felt seeing Erik and Mia in a trailer during a broadcast intended for worldwide audiences. For a brief moment, Dragon Quest Monsters fans were going absolutely wild. And then the further explanation that it's not a Monsters title anymore, that you're not getting another Monsters game, it pulls the rug out from under you. And then you play Dragon Quest Treasures anyway, hoping to at least get a similar depth out of it. Yeah, okay, it's not Monsters, but maybe it's still got some complexity, maybe there's a semblance of the series baked in, but it's not. Dragon Quest Treasures is overall a casual experience executing on very different ideas with different goals in mind. While the general opinion from critics and players was overall positive, a lot of that positivity had a tinge of deflation. It was fine. It's not what we wanted, but it was fine. Now, when it was released, I was one of those people. I liked Treasures well enough, but I was let down by expectation and anticipation. More than a year later though, when it re-released on PC and I picked it up again, I was honestly impressed by how much more I enjoyed Treasures. More than that, I was blown away by how clever Treasures actually was, and how much of the Dragon Quest Monsters identity was still present in its DNA. Dragon Quest Treasures deserves to be re-examined for what it is, not for what we wanted it to be. If you keep watching, I think you'll discover there's a lot to love about this Dragon Quest Monsters that never was. There's a great lesson to be learned here about scope, the joy of simplicity, and managing expectations. Dragon Quest Treasures features Erik and Mia, two siblings you may recognize from Dragon Quest XI. It serves as a prequel for the two, setting them on the course for an epic adventure through a mysterious faraway land. Erik and Mia agree to help their monster friends find the Dragonstones, legendary items said to reveal the way to the ultimate treasure, restoring the railroad company connecting the islands of Draconia in the process. However, they'll have to worry about the competition. Treasure hunting gangs across all of Draconia will try to steal their treasure, beat them to the Dragonstones, and even raid their base for their prized possessions. To survive, Erik and Mia will have to form a gang of their own, recruit monsters to their side, and use their various abilities to build their treasure trove, fight the rival gangs, and potentially save the world. It's important to realize that spiritually, Dragon Quest Treasures is still a Monsters title. It's been confirmed in several interviews that Treasures started out as a full-fledged Monsters entry. I remember this project starting up as a new entry for the Dragon Quest Monsters series, but Inuzuka-san proposed to turn it into a treasure hunting game, and I approved it. That was Yuji Horii in an interview with Prima Games on how Treasures became what it is today. But if we pair this with another quote from a Screen Rant interview with the godfather of the Monster series, Taichi Inuzuka, we get a better picture of how far along in development that Monsters project was. To answer this question, I think it is important to share that my main desire with this title was to create a game that players could enjoy casually. Around the middle phase of production of Dragon Quest Treasures, we experienced some changes to how we wanted to approach the game. It's a decent assumption Mr. Inuzuka probably didn't want to throw out everything they'd been working on mid-production. In fact, I'm willing to bet the treasure hunting aspects of Treasures were already a part of the initial idea of its monster's inception. This would definitely explain why these treasure hunting mechanics mesh so well with the monsters formula when we examine them through the lens of the series itself. Joker 3 was the apex of the monster series up to that point. Realizing they had reached the limits of what their turn-based RPG could do with battles, the Dragon Quest Monsters team chose to expand sideways. They introduced more exploration elements in Joker 3, designing areas to be navigated via platforming, hiding rare items in hard-to-reach places, and creating the Monster Ride system, which allowed players to glide, swim, and jump across great distances. These were the standout features of Joker 3, so it makes sense for a continuation of the series to build on them and reinforce this new layer of gameplay. And Dragon Quest Treasures does exactly that. The Monster Ride system has been adapted into fortes. Monsters in Treasures possess different fortes that function as exploration abilities. This could be gliding, jumping really high, burrowing underground, and so on. Each region is filled to the brim with secret areas, multiple routes to get to the same destinations, and require the clever use of your forte abilities to traverse them. Every monster in Draconia can sense treasure, and the siblings you play as can use their own treasure hunting powers in tandem to locate hidden treasure. This is the bread and butter of Treasures, using monster abilities to explore Draconia and sleuth out where treasure is buried. Bring that treasure back to base, get it appraised, raise your gang's level, and go back out and find some more. But treasure hunting isn't necessarily brand new. Joker 3 had a unique feature tied to the 3DS touchscreen, where players could scan the area for hidden chests with powerful items. So while it may seem like this treasure hunting idea came from nothing, it's actually building upon what Joker 3 introduced to the formula. If we compare the platforming elements of Joker 3 to Dragon Quest Treasures and think of the latter as the former successor, there are obvious improvements to level design here. The areas in Treasures are much more open, and reaching those secret areas requires a lot more creativity. Whereas monster riding in Joker 3 was more about using context-sensitive abilities in the right place, Treasures doesn't really care about how you get to where you want to go so long as you do. Glide from a higher point on the map, precariously jump onto little bits of rock on the side of a cliff, find the little crawl spaces tucked away behind your field of view, it doesn't matter. Treasures does it this way because, unlike Joker 3, where you would assign monsters to perform specific monster riding tasks, there's no way for you to have access to all fortes at once. So for the most part, you can always find a way to get to where you want to go, as long as you have a glide or a jump. And for every other case in Treasures where you definitely need a specific forte to reach a treasure chest or special area, tough tamales if you didn't come prepared. And I think I prefer it this way because of how often you revisit areas in Treasures. There's no limit to the amount of treasure you can find in Dragon Quest Treasures. Every so often, the treasure in every area resets, shuffling around where it's buried, refreshing what kind you can find, and replenishing the amount buried there. There's also a limit to how much treasure you can carry at any one time depending on the size of the monsters in your party. Because the main focus of Treasures is about finding treasure to raise your gang's overall value, you're constantly running back and forth between your base and the region you're in to get it all appraised once your inventory fills up. And you're returning to the same regions because there's quests you need to complete there to advance the main story. So even if you run into an instance where you can't reach a specific area, you can always run back to base, change your party composition, and come back to it without feeling like you're wasting time or valuable progress. And I know, this varies from person to person, right? Some people want to have every tool at their disposal when they're exploring because it feels like backtracking otherwise. But that's not really the point of exploring in Dragon Quest Treasures. It's not about checking items off a list to say you've completed them, it's about facilitating the overall quest structure and gameplay loop. You might be wondering, what exactly is the main scenario progression in Dragon Quest Treasures? Like, let's say you just want to play through the story and you don't really want to bother with any side content. I have bad but kind of interesting news. You can't. Well, you can, but it's going to feel like you're doing a bunch of side content anyway. See, in order to progress through treasures, you have to find the Dragon Stones. But to find the Dragon Stones reliably, you'll need to unlock and complete the various tiers of the Snarl, a dungeon where every floor challenges you with waves of enemies, where new tiers unlock as you raise your gang's level. To raise your gang's level, you need to go out and find treasure, but finding treasure usually requires you to explore vast swaths of every region, and that means unlocking more fast travel points. How do you unlock more fast travel points? By repairing railroad stations. How do you repair railroad stations? By completing tiers of the Snarl. This sounds really complicated on paper, but I promise it's way cooler in execution. What all this basically means is that you can do whatever you want. Find treasure, beeline the Dragon Stones, do every side quest. No matter what you choose to do in Dragon Quest Treasures, you will inevitably push the story forward. All of the main scenario requirements follow their own mini storylines that meld together to tell a story that somehow, despite being able to experience them at different points in your playthrough, remains cohesive and coherent and pretty good. And naturally, this doesn't work for everybody. It didn't work for me at first either. But over time, as I kept asking myself what exactly I was supposed to do, it dawned on me that I was doing what I wanted to do. And yet, at no point did I feel like I wasn't moving the story forward. Dragon Quest Treasures features non-linearity that somehow is still linear? I don't know how to explain it. Nothing is a digression, nothing is a distraction. It's built around making your specific focus a part of the narrative. And that's rad? I don't remember the last game I played that incorporated its side activities into the main scenario progression in this way. The gameplay loop of Dragon Quest Treasures is incredibly unique, albeit not exactly what people were necessarily looking for in a Dragon Quest Monsters title. But I would argue that this freedom to explore the world and advance the story in any way players see fit was an intended part of the series' evolution. But GC, you say, Treasures isn't a real Monsters game. Isn't it though? There are many more connections between Treasures and Monsters, largely surrounding the monsters themselves. Granted, there's only 70 different kinds of monsters in it, and this number is embarrassingly low for any Monsters title. As an example, fans lament Joker 3's paltry sum of 500 monsters, which in my opinion is plenty, but hey, I'm outnumbered here. But almost everything you'd expect to find in a Monsters title regarding the monsters is here. Each monster has their own suite of abilities they unlock as they grow in level, different stat growths emphasizing their role in battles, and different passive traits further differentiating their talents. Like in any Monsters entry, you can still strategize around the monsters at your disposal. It's imperative to have a monster equipped with healing skills, it's still good to have a monster with high defense to hopefully tank big hits from other enemies, and a monster with lots of attack power helps round out your party with decent damage output. Different monsters have their own sets of weaknesses and resistances to various elements, making some of them better candidates for different regions where those elements are more prevalent. But at the same time that Treasures is expanding on the exploration in the Monster series, it's also trying to marry the exploration to the Monsters component. Not only do you have to worry about your party composition in terms of battles, but you're also trying to maintain your selection of fortes. Every monster in Treasures is also capable of detecting different categories of treasure, and every region in Treasures changes what kind of treasure can be found there periodically. There is no monster synthesis in Dragon Quest Treasures, and it's certainly a part of the franchise players would argue is essential to the overall Monsters experience, but what exactly does monster synthesis do? What part of the gameplay loop does it reinforce? Hear me out. Pick any Monsters game, except maybe Caravan Heart. Why do you synthesize monsters? To make monsters stronger? To gain new abilities for battle? To tackle new areas or bosses with different setups in the hopes you succeed? So basically, you synthesize monsters to rotate your party, to keep it fresh and exciting, to meet the challenges that are presented to you. Okay, what if Treasures was asking you to do the same thing but without synthesis, to constantly rotate your party to match the challenges it was setting for you? What if all monster synthesis really is an excuse to experiment with different parties? And if that's all it is, then maybe Treasures retains this idea through different means. So no, you're not synthesizing monsters, but you're still changing out your party and trying to scout new monsters to swap in when the need arises. It's an abstraction of what monster synthesis is. The challenges in Dragon Quest Treasures are not as difficult as they are in another Monsters entry. It's very casual, but I think that's fitting for a Monsters title without monster synthesis. I think synthesizing monsters when there aren't many monsters to begin with, when those challenges aren't too demanding, would trivialize and diminish them even further. And the goal of a casual game isn't necessarily about removing all challenges entirely, it's just about making them less complicated than in something else. So of course there's no monster synthesis, but the effects of monster synthesis are still present. I think what turns a lot of people off to Dragon Quest Treasures is their insistence on focusing on the ways it isn't a monsters title, namely its combat system. Treasures isn't turn-based, and admittedly its action combat isn't much to write home about. While you don't have direct control over your monsters, you can use your slingshot to fire different kinds of pellets in battle. You can fire pellets of different melee and elemental types at enemies, or use support pellets to buff and heal your monsters. Buddy pellets can be used to increase the likelihood a monster will join your gang once you defeat it, similar to monster bites in previous Monsters entries. I would be lying to you if I said there was a hidden depth to the combat in Dragon Quest Treasures, but now is a good time to remind you of scope. The intent behind Treasures is to provide a casual experience for a casual audience, and if you can accept this, then what they do with this limited action-based gameplay is actually kind of neat. While battles against regular enemies are largely uneventful and end fairly quickly, I'd like to highlight Treasures' boss battles. If you've ever played a classic action-adventure title, the boss fights in Treasures will bring back fond memories. Instead of being all-out slugfests where you're scrambling to deal as much damage as possible, as fast as possible, every boss fight has rules you have to follow. For example, the first major boss of the Snarl will attempt to charge at you from a great distance. In order to expose his weak point, you have to bait him into parts of the arena to stun him. You have to repeat this process with the other bosses of the Snarl, but each one has a steadily evolving moveset, and the specific way to stun them is a little different every time. The final boss has its own gimmicks you'll have to figure out during the battle, and even incorporates exploration mechanics. Are any of these boss fights particularly challenging? No. Not for someone like you and me who are probably used to tougher video games, but within the scope of what Treasures is trying to achieve, this is a perfectly adequate and fitting level of challenge. It doesn't have to be hard to be designed well, and you don't have to be a casual player to be able to appreciate something easy so long as you approach it with the correct expectations. I know I'm coming to bat for Dragon Quest Treasures in somewhat of a "this game is just misunderstood" kind of way. I don't want to give it too much credit though. Even within the confines of reasonable expectation and sufficient understanding of what it sets out to do, it still needed a few tweaks here and there. You can't add markers to your map. This is really frustrating because you're always finding obviously important landmarks for a quest you don't have yet, or treasure chests you can't open because you don't have the right key and then forgetting where they are. Sometimes it's just an area you need a specific forte for, but good luck remembering where it is. For all the emphasis on finding treasure, and with how much treasure you can find in Draconia, you sure don't have all that much inventory space for it. At best, you're looking at 9 slots for treasure at a time. There are 3 different kinds of treasure you can find. Regular treasure, which tends to be the most valuable, bric-a-brac, which is more common than regular treasure, but valued less, and replicas, which are online-only treasures buried by other players. At some point, you have to start ignoring certain treasure spots if you want to collect better treasure. The amount of treasure available vastly outweighs your inventory space for it, and over time, it makes getting around really bothersome, because once your treasure slots fill up, you're compelled to hurry back to base to avoid losing it to a rival gang ambush or one of your monsters getting KO'd. And sometimes, you're just trying to finish one of your quest objectives, but since collecting treasure is progress, you sort of have to shoot yourself in one foot in order to save the other. And I don't know if you are aware, but no matter which foot you shoot, you're still down a foot. I feel like this inventory limit is antithetical to what Treasures wants players to do. You hit the inventory limit very early, and without a way to increase it, you start to care less about collecting treasure. If collecting treasure is the main focal point and theme of Dragon Quest Treasures, then feeling jaded about collecting treasure is the last thing I want to feel while playing it. And despite how interesting the separate parts of Dragon Quest Treasures are, they don't come together as tightly as you wish they would. The combo system in Treasures highlights this loose combination of ideas. In combat, it's possible to chain different types of attacks together in order to gain a huge damage boost against enemies. For example, if one of your monsters deals slash damage, you can follow up with a blunt damage pellet to create a combo attack. Your other monsters can then add to this combo with attacks of different damage types to extend it and increase the damage it does. Good luck making this happen reliably though. With everything else you have to worry about when it comes to party customization, this third layer of ensuring monster attacks synergize well rarely comes into play. And that's unfortunate, because if you could reliably use the combo system, Treasures' battles would amount to more than wailing on an enemy until they stop moving. In the same vein, monster traits and abilities outside of healing don't have a strong presence. Theoretically, they're making a difference in battles, but encounters are short and honestly hard to read. You don't feel their impact. Compare this to the traits in previous entries, where monsters get extra turns or automatically reflect all spells at enemies. Their benefit is immediately evident, whereas traits and treasures are more or less invisible. Scouting monsters is also a pain. It's easy enough to throw a buddy pellet, defeat the monster, and send them back to base, but there's a whole extra step to adding them to your roster. Each monster you scout requires a list of items you need to give them before they officially join your gang. Finding the items you need is yet another task you have to be mindful of when you're out treasure hunting. It also inhibits you from changing up your party more often. It limits the size of your gang and bottlenecks the otherwise casual, limitless experience Treasures strives to be. There's also a medal system. You can equip medals you collect from fallen enemies onto your monsters for stat boosts and special traits. But maintaining this as you're constantly swapping out monsters is more trouble than it's worth. The medals all kind of suck too, and again, you don't really feel the difference when you're in an encounter. Treasures is missing something. Even if this is intended to be a casual experience, even if the idea behind it was to make something light and easy to play through, I can't shake the feeling that Treasures is incomplete in some way. It's almost as if something was ripped out of it. And as we know, this is indeed the case, but I'm not saying Treasures needed the missing monsters elements to feel whole. This isn't about it not having turn-based combat or monster synthesis. It's missing the refinement of ideas that Monsters is known for. It's missing a connective tissue or polish or whatever you want to call it that allows the mechanics to play off of one another. What you have in Treasures are individual features without the quality of life and attention to detail that should bring them together. But I stand my ground and insist that Treasures accomplishes what it sets out to do well enough. Casual experiences live and die on their novelty, hence why many casual games tend to be short. Dragon Quest Treasures isn't any different. Around the time the novelty started to run dry for me, I decided to look up how long a standard playthrough of Treasures was. It turns out I was almost at the end. Rather than stretch out these neat ideas across a 40-hour RPG, Treasures is over in about half of that. And it ends on a high note, with a great final boss and a heartwarming conclusion I can get behind. Dragon Quest Treasures might not be a Monsters entry in name, but it's hard not to see the spirit of the series alive inside of it. It doesn't feature key components of the Monsters series, but the fact that it serves as a continuation of ideas introduced in Joker 3 is irrefutable. It lacks the iconic monster synthesis, but it repackages the purpose behind monster synthesis inside of different mechanics. As a hardcore Monsters title, it definitely doesn't fit the bill, but it's not trying to be one. It's a lightweight reflection of the Monster series, doing its own thing and at the same time acknowledging its origins. Treasures left a space open for a classic Monsters title, and the Dragon Quest team was prepared to fill it. It wouldn't be long after Treasures released that they would announce a new Dragon Quest Monsters, a true sequel to the first two Monsters entries, and knowing what we know now, I wonder what would have happened if they didn't pivot Treasures into what it ended up being. Because the next installment of Dragon Quest Monsters also has a little something missing, and it coincidentally is in the same shape of what Treasures set out to do. A lot of fans speculate that were things different, these two entries combined could have been the ideal modern Monsters title. Alas, all we have is speculation. As for how that new Dragon Quest Monsters would turn out is a story for another time.